With the removal and return of Hextech chests being one of the biggest walkbacks that we as the League community have ever experienced, it got me thinking about other times in League's history where Riot made decisions so bad that they literally couldn't even double down on them, probably hoping that you would just forget that they ever happened in the first place. Now, there were plenty of options to consider while making this list, but to keep things interesting, I wanted to get a diverse spread of these not so great changes, with the first mistake on this list actually not even taking place on Summoner's Rift, but instead on the freezing cold bridge of the Howling Abyss. You see, alongside jungle Pokemon, extra explosive blast cones, and an updated ping system that was definitely used as intended, just a couple of days before the official launch of preseason 2023, Riot announced some new quality of life changes to ARAM, and while there were some nice touch-ups such as additional brushes and the much needed addition of hex gates, one change that wasn't met with quite the same excitement was the addition of falling towers. While League's towers have obviously always collapsed into a pile of rubble when they're destroyed, this change actually took the shattered stone of each side's first turret and turned it into a wall of terrain, blocking off the half of the bridge it fell on and only leaving those who wish to go through with a very narrow path, which on paper sounds like a good way to mix things up with a bit of randomness each game. Well, that is until players realized that this toppled turret was just a free choke point to pick apart their opponents. Even if you weren't playing a champion with a wall like Anivia, who absolutely loved this change, champions with hooks unsurprisingly became a nightmare to deal with, especially since the fog of war created by these turrets was more than enough to make Blitzcrank players happy while their opponents didn't exactly feel the same way. Due to community complaints and an increase in quote degenerative states, this change only ended up lasting a little over 2 months before it was eventually canned, but unfortunately this didn't even come close to what is arguably one of the biggest PR disasters in Riot's history, which actually happened just a couple weeks later. But before we get to that nightmare in just a little bit, we'll first need to visit a different PR failure that was one of the most needlessly stupid decisions League has ever seen in Riot's attempt to remove all chat. Now, calling League a toxic game is about as groundbreaking as saying that Panzer Dragon's channel has become a Baus alt account, as this is a problem not only seen in game, but also in Reddit comments, tweets, and in videos that spark more emotional outrage for views. Understandably, Riot has tried to combat this problem with increased punishments for poor behavior, as well as previous attempts to increase the value of being honorable. And while these generally have been neutral to positive changes on the whole, in November of 2021, League's update team dropped a bombshell on the community in one of the most infamous dev blogs in the game's history, simply titled "Disabling All Chat." As you may have expected, this was pretty much a brief PR article explaining Riot's thought process behind the removal of such a core League function. But what really caught players off guard was that this change was planned to be effective almost immediately, and people weren't happy about it, and for good reason. Firstly, when it comes to toxicity, team chat was and still is significantly worse than all chat. I mean, that's a no-brainer, but what was even more insane was that not only could you already disable all chat in settings if you didn't want to see it, but you literally had to opt into using it in the first place because it was something that was turned off by default. Like, if you felt all chat was toxic, you could just choose to not see it, and it seems that Riot forgot about this because it didn't take long for them to backpedal, and fast. Following the massive backlash from their original article, Riot announced that they were going to slowly try these changes out by disabling it only in some regions instead of all of them as a sort of test run. And well, it never really ended up becoming a problem after all, because you can still type GG at the end of each game, which still might be a little hot for some League players to handle. But though this change was pretty pointless to begin with, at least it didn't ruin the game for several months, as if we want to talk about Riot making some controversial changes, we needn't look any further than the 2021 items overhaul and the introduction of one of the most overpowered mythics in the game's history, OG Stridebreaker. By deciding to revamp one of the game's most crucial systems when it comes to balancing champions, it shouldn't have come as a surprise that alongside these sweeping changes, there were some pretty major balancing problems that needed to be fixed. And though it took Riot a little while to get things somewhat under control, one item that was especially hard to figure out was the introduction of Stridebreaker, and particularly its active effect. You see, the version of Stridebreaker that we have today slows enemy champions in a circle around the player who casted it, which is a useful item for fighter champions who traditionally have a hard time sticking to targets and prefer their fights up close and personal. But the thing is, the original version of this item had this slow and a free dash, which pretty much meant that the item covered the biggest weaknesses the fighter class has, because if you were an ADC player, you would somehow have to escape a Darius who now had a dash and slow available every 15 seconds, which as you can guess was kind of a nightmare. Despite being a very strong item that only for a brief while was able to hide its power behind the drastically overtuned Gourd Drinker, it would take Riot over 7 months to rework this item into having the active that we know of today, which even though this was a much needed change for the better, as someone who's a Set and Darius main, well, I'd be lying if I say this didn't still sting a bit even to this day. Also, only about 1% of those who watch my videos actually support the content by subscribing, so if you'd like to help a full-time college student chase a dream, well, I would greatly appreciate it, as you can always change your mind later. But anyways, even though Stridebreaker's rework was a positive change for the game, the same really can't be said about LeBlanc's rework in 2016, which was so catastrophically bad that it was literally reverted entirely. Now, this rework was a part of a larger Assassin class update, which also had a lot of problems. I mean, Rengar's Q had a weird swimming animation, Shaco was arguably worse off than he was before the rework, and Akali would get a full-on VGU just a couple of years later. But even still, LeBlanc's changes were arguably the worst of them all. As we've all likely experienced before, LeBlanc is a very snowbally champion, making her offer very little to a team when she's behind and dealing some absolutely insane damage when she gets ahead. And while Riot didn't really want to change this, they did want to make her play more into her role as a deceiver who utilizes misdirection, stating that, quote, "To be deceived, you have to have enough time to understand what's happening and be wrong about it," which was a good idea that unfortunately ended up being executed pretty poorly. To make a long story short, this reworked version of LeBlanc was disliked by basically almost everybody, as she was incredibly strong, consistently having one of the highest, if not the single highest ban rate in the entire game, while also being a monster in pro play. But while you may imagine that at least LeBlanc mains were happy about their reworked champion being so strong, well, even still that wasn't really the case. With LeBlanc's new passive applying her sigil of Malice Spark only after waiting for a short delay, the champion felt a lot worse in terms of bursting down opponents, even if she was pretty much a late game Ryze who could also split push and heal with Gunblade while also being very hard to catch. Also, it's worth noting that LeBlanc's reworked ultimate was granted the ability to spawn a cloned version of herself anywhere on the map, which was a cool idea on paper, but even still, her new ultimate being able to mimic any ability in her kit was very strong and not really used in the deceptive way that Riot had hoped, with all these changes resulting in Riot pulling an incredibly rare reverting of the champion after a full year of being a nightmare for pretty much everyone. But while we'll get to an even more wildly unbalanced class rework in just a little bit, if we want to narrow in on one of the most insane patches in the game's history, we needn't look any further than 2014's patch 4.20 and the accidental abomination of the fittingly nicknamed Weedwick. With this patch being the first one headed into preseason 2015, as expected, Riot released their yearly sweeping changes by introducing features that we still see today, such as Baron empowered minions, new elixirs, and of course the annual reworking of the jungle, which introduced everyone's favorite Scuttle Crab. But as you may have guessed, there still were a lot of balancing issues that began to plague the Rift, especially in regards to making the jungle much harder to clear than usual, which was incredibly beneficial for a champion like pre-rework Warwick. Though this Wrath of Zon was already expected to be one of the strongest picks of the patch due to his immense sustain, clear speed, and overall safety, what truly uncaged this werewolf's ability to become an outright monster was that not only could he beat out basically all of his competition in the jungle, but he became arguably the most busted 1v1 champion the game has ever seen, all thanks in part to his ability to abuse some of the preseason's new items, which were even more powerful when combined with his then point-and-click version of his Infinite Duress ultimate. With the introduction of a new set of smite-based items, players realized that by buying the Skirmisher Saber route for your smite upgrade, each auto attack would deal an additional 18 to 69 true damage, not as a bleed, but every single time an auto attack hit, which could also be boosted with higher attack speed and more damage if you chose to enchant your jungle item with Devourer. Essentially, you now just had an already strong Warwick with a point-and-click ultimate where he just auto-attacks you as fast as possible, combined with items that gave insane auto-attack stats and attack speed, meaning that he could literally point-and-click 100-0 champions while also having some of the best, if not the outright best, control of jungle in the entire game, leading to the champion having an insane 60% win rate when picked and a 62% ban rate overall, which are stats that even to this day are almost entirely unheard of. But while Warwick's reign of terror only lasted for a brief while before the werewolf was eventually shot down with a Nerf gun, at least this insane mistake didn't last for an entire year, as there was actually a time where Riot straight up removed solo queue for basically all of 2016, instead replacing it with what they believed to be the future of League, dynamic queue. You see, even though League's rank system today has an option to play either in a solo duo queue or in a flex queue with up to 4 of your friends, for the entirety of 2016's ranked season, these two queues were combined into one, with Riot themselves even stating that they would never bring back the option for solo queue because this mode was here to stay. Now, to give credit where it's due, Dynamic Queue did bring with it a much less chaotic champion select since players could now choose their roles before heading into game. However, as you may have expected, combining all ranked players into just one queue brought with it a lot of problems, and players across all skill levels were not happy about it. Queue times were long due to the matchmaking system trying to place the proper combinations of players and pre-mains against each other, boosting ranks became significantly easier, and if you happen to be especially high elo, you could literally queue into entire pro teams, which that was about as much fun as you may expect. With this change being presented as the future of League's ranked experience, there was no shortage of community frustration being shared about how disastrous this change was to one of the game's most core features, with the disapproval being so clear that despite doubling down on this decision, Riot would eventually admit their mistake in August around 2/3 into the ranked season, by finally giving high-level players the option to once again solo queue before fully reverting these changes back to their current state in 2017. And though we've already talked about Riot's gameplay and balancing teams not exactly being known for their spotless record, one part of League that had never seemed to fail was their incredible cinematics team, which had pretty much only released bangers year after year with really no exceptions. Well, that is until a certain cinematic was released to kick off the beginning of season 2023. As I'm sure we're all aware of by now, League's seasonal cinematics are a huge deal, even being a yearly tradition by those who don't even play the game purely for how stunning they are in both their visuals and incredible soundtracks, with 2022's cinematic The Call during the year prior being arguably the best one Riot had ever released, so naturally the expectation for 2023's project was immense. After all, League cinematics have often served as a chance to develop lore, see champions fight against one another in all their glory, and be an overall celebration of all the game has built up during its existence. So to say that 2023's Brink of Infinity cinematic was a disappointment would be a massive, massive understatement.
That's not the season. That's not the cinematic. Where's the cinematic?
So I'd imagine when rank drops tomorrow, they're gonna release the real one. Because this is like what is it? Like a prelude, like a intro to the actual one for sure.
No way, this is their season 2023 cinematic. Bro, there's nothing cool about it. It was literally the f***ing map.
Somehow, this cinematic trailer had no champions, no iconic soundtrack, and the voiceover was just a random compilation of inspirational champion voice lines, all while just flying a camera through an HD rendering of Summoner's Rift, which had nothing to do with any updates to the game. Like, I still cannot comprehend what the decision making was behind this idea, or at the very least why there was no warning about the lower quality for 2023's project, because until recently this was in contention for the most outraged the League community had ever been. especially following a very lackluster 2021 and 2022, which I touched on briefly in my previous video. League's upcoming seasonal cinematic was more or less being regarded as the one thing players could actually look forward to after such a rough couple of seasons, but even now that too had been taken away. Now, thankfully, Riot did once again return to their cinematic glory in 2024 with Still Here, and now again with bite marks this season as well. But unfortunately, this wasn't the only time that Riot has fumbled the bag when the world was watching, as in a return to infamous patches, we of course have to visit the now infamous Juggernaut patch that ruined Worlds 2015. As you may recall, just 2 patches before the official Worlds patch, Riot dropped some massive changes by adding new items, reworking already existing ones, and revamping 4 champions, which understandably led to chaos. Skarner's rework released at an unheard of 65% win rate, Mordekaiser became a bot laner who could now possess Dragon, and champions such as Gangplank and Fiora were just broken, making it incredibly rough for basically anyone who wasn't playing a Juggernaut, as these beasts ran the rift, terrorizing ADCs and ruining the stability of pro play. You see, when it came time for Worlds just a couple of weeks later, these changes basically flipped pro play's entire meta on its head, which forced players to learn new champions and new strategies, all while playing on a patch that still had a lot of work to be done in terms of it being balanced. Also, keep in mind that teams only had 3 bans each during this time, and with the prio pick of Gragas being disabled due to a bug, nearly the same champions were banned in every single game, leading to an incredibly stagnant meta, which left fans watching the same game over and over again, with these matches of course being steamrolled by these unstoppable juggernauts. I appreciate you taking the time to check out this video, especially if this is your first time watching the channel. If that's the case, feel free to subscribe or maybe click one of these 2 videos coming up if you enjoyed. But yeah, with that all being said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Later!